Chapter 5. Neil. I hated leaving Abby alone, although she would never admit it. I could see she was beginning to feel uneasy about her decision to stay there. This house wasn't quite what she'd been expecting, and the mystery of its existence was something that still weighed heavy on her mind. Even I couldn't shake away the feelings of unease that had settled on my shoulders the moment I'd stepped through the front door. I'd never been one to believe that houses could manifest energy, but being in that house didn't make me feel good. Abby smiled as she waved me off, but I could see the shadows that lingered beneath. I desperately hoped she would be okay without me. It was nearing midday when I got my first message from her. The words sent a prickle of unease along the back of my neck. Something's still thudding around up in the attic. I'd thought the cat had been responsible, but apparently there was something else up there too. I texted her back telling her not to go up there and to make sure she kept the bedroom door shut. It was probably just another animal, but I didn't want her doing anything reckless while she was on her own. The next one came later that afternoon when I was resting at home. We'd agreed that it had made more sense for me to stay here rather than driving back to Crow House every night. But after seeing her message, I was wondering if it wasn't better for me to go back after all. Maybe I'm just being silly, but I feel like I'm not alone here. Instead of texting back, I dialed her number. She answered straight away. "I don't mean to worry you," she said without the preamble, but I could hear the shakiness of her voice. "I think I'm just letting things get to me." Hey, slow down," I urged gently. "It's okay. Tell me what happened." "Nothing happened," she said, her words coming out hesitantly. "Well, not exactly. It's just, I keep thinking I can hear things, like someone crying or someone walking around upstairs. I know it's probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I just got a little spooked. That's all," she said with a forced chuckle. "I'm fine, though, really." I breathed heavily through my nose. "I can come back." "No," she said quickly. "I told you I'm fine. Please, don't worry." "Do you feel like you're in danger at all?" "What? No, of course not," she said almost breathlessly. "Just paranoid, that's all." "If anything happens, call the police and then me. I'll be there as soon as I can." "I know," she said, her voice dropping to a softer tone. "Thank you. I'm sorry for disturbing you." "Don't apologize, as long as you're okay." Yeah, I'm fine. I'll call you later, okay?" She let out a slow breath. "Okay. Love you." "Love you too." She hung up and I set the phone down with a sigh. Part of me was tempted to just blame the grief. I knew it manifested differently for everyone, and I knew Abby was strong. But nobody could deal with a loss so heavy without some kind of repercussion. And yet part of me felt uneasy too. There was something about the house that had made me feel off. If I was there alone, I had no doubt paranoia would start creeping up on me too. Almost before I knew what I was doing, I punched a number into the phone and hit dial. After a few rings, Gemma, Abby's best friend, answered. "Hello?" "Hey, Gem. It's Neil. I need your help with something." "Help? Is everything okay?" "Yeah, kind of. It's about the house. The one Abby inherited from her mother."
"What about it?"
"I need your help with some research. You have access to the library archives, right?"
Well, yeah, of course."
She stuttered.
"What is it you need?"
"I need you to pull every record you can find on Crow House." Chapter 6. Abigail. The house felt different when I was on my own. It seemed bigger, emptier. Things echoed more, and the silence between felt misplaced. I felt unwelcome, like I didn't belong. Something flesh and blood amongst all the shadow and dust. I decided to stay in the sitting room again tonight. Although I'd cleaned up the master bedroom, something felt wrong about sleeping in there when it had once belonged to someone else. Despite what the attorney had said, the house didn't feel like it was mine. Not yet. It was still a stranger to me, a long-lost relative I'd only just met. After the strange events of the day, I felt exhausted. I tried to tell myself that it had been nothing but illusions of my imagination, conjured by grief and fatigue. I'd searched the house several times, and I was the only one here. The crying, the footsteps, all in my head. Or at least a distortion of perception. Unfamiliar noises that had morphed into something familiar for my mind to comprehend. That must have been it. Even so, I had difficulty falling asleep that night. The cat came and curled up at the foot of the couch, and I listened to it snoring quietly, wondering if, like me, it felt like a stranger here. Or if it had been stuck in the attic long enough to forge some kind of bond with it. I watched shadows dance along the ceiling until my eyes grew heavy, and I finally fell into a restless sleep. There was a child crying close by. I could hear the soft, shaking hiccups of its sobs, the wet splash of tears. "Where are you?" I tried to ask, but the words fell dead from my lips, curling to the ground like insect husks. "I want to help you." The crying did not stop, but I became aware of other sounds. The soft hiss and crackle of fire, wood snapping, glass shattering. The smell of gasoline and smoke creeping into the back of my lungs, making me choke. Fire. There was fire. Was the child trapped? I realized then that I couldn't see. I was in darkness. I tried to reach out, but my hands touched nothing. Nothing but that cold, clammy dark that wrapped itself around me. Then a voice, sounding close and yet so far away. A child's voice, a whimper. "Help me." When I woke up, the fire had followed me out of my dreams and into waking reality. I could smell gas. A strange film coated my lips. The air felt heavy, wrong. I jolted up, the blankets wrapping around my legs and tripping me up as I tried to scramble off the couch. The cat shrieked as I accidentally kicked it, darting to hide beneath the coffee table. But I was already out of the room. The smell led me to the kitchen. As soon as I opened the door, I fought the urge to gag. One of the gas rings was switched on at the stove. Pressing a hand over my mouth and nose, I stumbled, half dazedly, towards it, twisting the dial to switch off the heat. I pulled the plug out of the socket in the wall, then opened all the windows, letting the lingering gas seep out until I could breathe properly again. My heart was still thundering in my chest, and I stood with my back against the window, letting the cool air wash the sweat from my brow. But the panic reared again when I forced myself to address the inevitable question. Who had turned the stove on? I hadn't used it since the day before, and I was certain I would have noticed if I had left it on. It didn't make sense. And then there was that dream. Most of it was already slipping from my memory, like sand between my fingers. But I remembered enough. A child crying. A fire. Always fire. What the hell was going on? Was it this house? Was it me? I didn't understand it, but it scared me. I was starting to scare myself. I never acted like this. All this paranoia and fear. I felt like my head was turning against me, making me feel things that it shouldn't, hear things that weren't there. Maybe it was the grief, the stress, the difficulty of these past few months, all leading up to this. Or maybe it was this place. This strange house that had been locked up for years, slowly forgotten about, left to rot in the shadows. Maybe I should have let it be. I forced myself to go back to bed. It wasn't doing me any good, dwelling on things I didn't understand. What I needed was rest. When I returned to the sitting room, the cat was still hiding beneath the coffee table, two eyes glowing from the darkness. I approached it with my hand outstretched, trying to coax it out, but it only whined and retreated further away. It seemed scared of something, but I wasn't sure why. Sighing, I slumped back onto the couch, my heart still beating an erratic rhythm in my chest. Although I was tired, my body wouldn't let me go back to sleep. I felt too restless, too agitated by the mystery of the stove. Had someone else switched it on? Or was it some kind of electrical malfunction? The oven was an ancient thing, just like the rest of the furniture in the house. It was all outdated now, giving me a sense of its long abandonment. When was the last time someone had lived here? I was snapped out of my thoughts by a low, impatient whine. The cat had slunk out from beneath the table and was now sitting at the door of the sitting room, staring up at it. "You want to leave?" I muttered, getting to my feet again. I opened the door, hovering over the cat until it put a paw over the threshold, and then paused. It whined again, but this time it sounded more distressed, rising in pitch. I watched as the fur along its back rose, and its tail thumped agitatedly along the floor. "What's wrong?" I asked, flicking my gaze out into the hallway. Darkness pooled along the edges of the skirting, only thin threads of moonlight giving enough illumination to see the staircase. "Are you going?" The cat paced forward, and then back again with the same pained whine. It seemed distressed about something. I sighed. Fatigue was wearing away at my patience. What's the matter with you? Are you going out there or staying in here? The cat turned suddenly and darted back to the coffee table, curling beneath it with another soft cry. I crouched with my back to the door, squinting against the gloom to see what was wrong with the cat. Maybe it was just annoyed with me. I think I remembered kicking it in my haste to get up. Sorry about that, I muttered as if it would help. I'll give you some more ham in. The words died on my throat, and goose flesh spread across my whole body. For some inexplicable reason, I felt terrified to turn around. It was a feeling I'd never experienced before, but my whole body seemed to react to something I couldn't see. A shift in the air. A draft peeled in from the kitchen, stirring the hair against the back of my neck. I felt suddenly that I was no longer alone. My breaths came out in short, tumbling gasps, and my legs were starting to cramp from being crouched. Yet I dared not move. The cat whined again from beneath the table, and in the silence between, I thought I heard something else. Movement behind me. The shuffle of footsteps. The rustle of clothing. I could have been wrong. I hoped I was wrong. I wanted to look, but my body was telling me not to. I stayed there, hunched on the floor, hardly daring to breathe, until the sensation passed and the weight lifted from the atmosphere. I collapsed forward, throwing out my hands to break the fall, and sucked in long, gasping breaths as though I'd just run a marathon. What the hell had just happened? Even now, I was reluctant to turn around, but I forced myself to. The doorway was empty. The hallway beyond was empty. There was nobody, or nothing, there. I wanted to tell myself I had imagined the whole thing, but the way my body had reacted told me otherwise. It was like some primal instinct urging me to protect myself. The mantra of, if I couldn't see it, it couldn't hurt me. The cat poked its head out from under the table, blinking at me with curiosity, and then slunk out. If the cat seemed it safe enough to come out, I supposed I should too. Slowly pushing myself to my feet, I closed the door behind me and tiptoed back to the couch. The cat jumped up a moment later, settling itself on my legs. I found myself glad of its company. It might look and smell unpleasant, but it was my only companion in this old, strange house I had found myself in. Chapter 7. Abigail. I woke up the following morning, feeling bleak and unrested. The night before seemed almost a dream, but when I stepped into the kitchen, there was still the lingering smell of gas in the air that was very much real. I decided to keep the oven unplugged and not use it until I was sure it wasn't a hazard. There was still a lot to do in the house, but I decided to take the morning slow. After last night, I wanted to make sure my head was in the right place. Those things I'd felt, the strange, crippling fear and paranoia that I wasn't alone in the house, could have been a product of my overwhelming stress and doubt. I'd taken on something big when I signed my name on the house's ownership. This house, which I knew so little about. I found myself going up to the study. It was the only room in the house that had documents and books lying about. Perhaps I could glean something from them about the house's former residents. The door to the study jammed when I tried it, as though the lock had stuck. But after a few attempts of hitting my shoulder against the wood, I eventually managed to force it open, half stumbling inside. It was just as Neil and I had left it. Books still strewn about the desk, papers still littered along the floor. The hearth still bleeding black ash from a fire that went out years ago. Just how long ago, though? The house had a strange sort of timelessness to it that, even beneath all the dust, it was difficult to tell just how long ago someone had lived it. It could have been abandoned for decades, or not that long at all. Leaving the door open behind me, lest it get stuck again and trap me inside, I moved over to the desk and seated myself in the high-backed wooden chair, wondering who had sat in it before me. I pulled the building plans towards me again, seeing them clearly for the first time. It was Crow House. Looking for a date amongst the smudged ink, I could just make out in the corner the numbers 194. The 1940s? Mr. Porter had said the place was built in the early 1900s, so this was dated a few decades after it. Maybe the house had been remodeled or repaired from some old damage. When the place had been inherited into my family, maybe. I shuffled through the other sheafs of paper, but could glean little from them. The ink was too faded, and most of them looked to be general agreements and documents. The signatures on them were too difficult to make out, too. I abandoned the papers and moved on to searching through the desk's simple compartments. There were only 2 drawers that were unlocked. The first contained more documents, but I found something interesting in the second. Photographs. They were old and terribly faded, but if I looked hard enough, I could make out the features of the faces photographed. I didn't immediately recognize the faces, but something struck me as familiar. There were 3 in all. The first showed a man, tall and well-built, with a slightly rugged but handsome face. When I turned it over, the letters Uncle P were scrawled on the back in black ink. The second one was of a young girl with blonde curls and an inquisitive face. It was her that struck me with a sense of familiarity. The last one was a photograph of 5 people stood outside a house. This house. The man and girl from the other photos was there, as well as another young girl who looked almost identical, and a man and woman. They looked like a family. When I turned the photo over, I felt my breath catch. The Owens. Owens. My family name. In the corner was a date, too. 1918. Was that when they had lived here? But what had happened to the Crow family? There were still things that didn't make sense, but at least I was starting to build a picture of the house's history. My family had lived here since 1918. That was a long time, just over a century. So why hadn't I heard of this place before? Why had my mother never brought it up, but just left it here, unloved and abandoned? I studied the picture of the girl again. Even though it was black and white, and the ink had faded in places, I could see the bright curiosity in her eyes, in the quirk of her lips, the round curve of her chin. She looked so familiar. Where had I seen her before? Who was she? No, I gasped softly. It can't be. There was no name on the back, but one was sitting at the edge of my lips. Lucy. Grandma Lucy. She must have been young here, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, though her face had a certain maturity to it. I hadn't known my grandma very well. She'd had my mother quite late on in life and had died when I was still fairly young. I hadn't really been old enough to form proper memories of her, but I remembered those eyes. She always seemed a bright, intelligent woman, and I could see that in her face even as a child. I didn't recognize anyone else, though. The other girl looked remarkably similar, but I don't recall Grandma ever having a sister. Perhaps she had died earlier on. There was still a lot I didn't know about my family. My mother and I had been close, but it had only ever been us. Ever since my father had walked out, severing any ties between us. I had no other relations, and now it was just me. I'd never felt so alone. I placed the photographs on the table with a sigh. At least I knew now that my grandma had lived here, a long time ago. I didn't know if she'd stayed or rented the house out to others. But she hadn't been living here when she died. She died in a hospital, with my mother sobbing at her side. It was one of my few memories of her, and as much as I hated it, I held on to it, because it was all I had. I wish I'd been able to know her properly, but it was too late now. Something thumped against the ceiling above me, showering bits of loose plaster onto the floor. I shuddered involuntarily at the thought of animals living up there. I really had to get someone in to take a look. The room went dark suddenly, and when I looked out the window, the sun had gone. Heavy clouds were beginning to roll in, and I could almost taste the ozone in the air. It was either going to rain or there was a storm coming. I didn't fancy being trapped in this old house through a flash flood, but there was nothing I could do. Neil had taken the car for work. I was essentially trapped here. The rain hit later that afternoon. It came down in a torrent, all at once. I could hear it thrumming against the pavestones outside, tapping against the windows, dripping from the gutters. The grass outside quickly became waterlogged, and muddy trenches cut through the road. It didn't take long for it to get inside the house either. It explained the damp if rain had been getting in all this time. There was a leak in the hallway, and a small puddle was growing on the stairs. It must have been dripping through from the first floor, but when I went to investigate, I couldn't find where it was stemming from. Rummaging through the cupboards in the kitchen, I found an old bucket and set it beneath the leak to catch the excess water, then settled on the couch in the living room to watch the rain. I was feeling languid and uninspired to clean anymore. The rain seemed to bring with it an oppressive heaviness, as though the whole sky was weighing down on the house. Part of me didn't feel safe here. I felt exposed and vulnerable in a building that was probably falling apart at its seams. And I'd come here with the grand delusions of transforming it into something new. I'd never be able to do that if I couldn't let go of the past, yet I felt tethered to it. Now that I knew my grandma had lived here in her childhood, I had to know what had happened here. Why my mother had kept it a secret all these years. The cat, who I had yet to name, for fear of getting too attached, was curled up beneath the coffee table again. its favorite place to hide, apparently. It seemed unperturbed by the rain, its twisted ears twitching in its dreams. As I watched it, I couldn't help but remember the night before, when it had seemed scared of something, and my own response full of fear. What was that about? I had never entertained the possibility of ghosts or hauntings before, but that was the first thing that came to mind when I remembered last night. That feeling of not being alone, but not being in the presence of flesh and blood either. What else could I call that, if not some kind of paranormal perception? It felt much more real than my mind simply manifesting its stress. I wondered what I would have seen, if anything, had I ignored my body's warnings and turned around. A thud from the hallway startled me to my feet. The cat blinked open a sleepy eye, resting it on me for a moment, before nestling deeper into the shadows. It was different to the thumps I normally heard upstairs. This sounded much closer. Moving over to the door on quiet feet, I gently peeled it open. The hallway was empty, but my eyes immediately fell on the bucket at the bottom of the steps. It was on its side, still rolling slightly with motion, water spilling out onto the carpet. Had it fallen over? I thought it had been pretty secure on the step, but perhaps it had been resting on a slant I hadn't noticed. Breathing out a sigh, I went over to pick the bucket back up and froze. There was water on the steps, but that isn't what made my heart trip up over itself and thud brutishly in my chest. There were footprints, too. Wet footprints, tracking water all the way up the stairs. Far too small to belong to me. Small enough to belong to a child. But that was impossible. There was no child here. There was nobody here but me. The bucket slipped out of my grasp, thudding back to the floor, but I barely noticed it. My mind was still trying to come up with a rational answer to what I was seeing. Where had the footprints come from? Who did they belong to? Was I not alone here after all? My mouth went dry, and I subconsciously wetted my lips with my tongue, lifting my eyes to the top of the staircase. The glimmer of water grew fainter the further up they got, but whoever had made the footprints had clearly gone upstairs. Were they still up there? I couldn't hear anything, even when I held my breath. Tried to listen past the pulse in my ears. There was no movement. With trembling fingers, I reached for the banister and began to ascend the stairs. My feet moved slowly, with reluctance, trying not to make too much noise. If there was someone here, I wanted to catch them by surprise. That would give me the advantage in case they tried to run. I made it to the top of the steps without so much as a creak, peering around the wall to the landing. There were more footsteps, patterned across the hardwood floor. They led all the way to the door at the end. The study. It was open now. I was certain I'd closed it before. Heart stammering in my throat, I moved silently to the study, where I'd found the photographs of my grandmother. I wrapped my fingers around the edge of the door, tentatively pushing it open, and looked inside. There was a figure facing away from me. A child, with plaited brown hair, dressed in an old-fashioned nightgown. I opened my mouth to speak, but only a soft gasp came out, unable to find the words. This child, who was she? What was she doing here? I shuffled forward, and my foot pressed down on one of the looser floorboards, eliciting a long groan. The child turned around, and I felt horror and fear grip me into place. Her face was missing. There was nothing but gruesome red scars, pockmarked flesh, completely covered in burns. Her jaw opened, and a soft gurgle of words came out in a voice barely recognizable as human. Help me. Chapter 8. Neil. 2 fires?
Yeah, that's what I could pull from the records,
Jem said from the other end of the phone.
The house was destroyed twice by fire. It has quite the tragic history.
I let her words sink in, chewing anxiously on a fingernail. 2 fires. Tragic history. What else did you find?
Well, it was difficult to find, but I managed to get some articles from the period that gave me a few more details. The house, as you probably know, was built in 1905 by a man called Howard Crow. He was a blacksmith and had built quite a reputation for his wealth and skill. He and his wife, as well as their daughter, lived there until 1913. That's when the first fire broke out. The details were a little hazy, but the paper reported it to have been an accident. It took all 3 lives.
All of them? I repeated incredulously. The whole family died?
Yeah, that's what it says,
Jem said. In the background, I could hear the shuffle of papers. She worked as a librarian at the public library, and her clearance gave her access to some of the archives that were off limits to even the public. She was the perfect person to ask for information about this sort of thing.
A man called Philip Owens bought the house in 1917. He rebuilt the parts of the house that were destroyed by the fire and moved his brother's family in with him. There isn't much about the family itself, but there's a picture. It looks like there was a man and wife, and 2 daughters. All 5 of them lived in the house until 1919.
Another fire? I asked, my voice sounding strangely far away.
Yes, sadly. There was a terrible storm one night. The house was struck with lightning, the article says, and the whole family apart from 1 child was killed.
There was a survivor? Jem cleared her throat, shuffling paper again.
Yes, a child called Lucy Owens.
I didn't recognize the name Lucy, but Owens was Abby's family name. She hadn't told me much about her family history, but I had begun to suspect she didn't know much about it herself. I shifted the phone to the other ear, using my free hand to scroll down the article I was reading. I'd been doing some research of my own, but I hadn't found nearly the amount of detail Gemma had. What happened after that?
Things get a little hazy after that. The house doesn't really come up in the news, but from residency documents, it seems that Lucy is the official inheritor of the house. The Owens were a small family, and all of her relatives were dead by that point. I'm presuming she lived with a guardian until she was old enough, but I can't corroborate that. The next time the house resurfaces in any form of documentation is in the 1940s. I have construction plans, commissioned by Lucy for rebuilding the house in 1947. It looks like she lived there for a short period, but eventually renting the house out to tenants. And this is when things get a little weird. I frowned.
Weird?
Well, maybe it's expected for an old house, but nobody ever stayed long. I've found quite a few speculative articles about the place being haunted.
Haunted?
I choked out, the phone almost slipping from my hands.
I don't know why it took me so by surprise. I was half expecting the word to come up at some point.
Like I said, they're just speculation,
Jem added quickly.
There's no definite proof, but people's experiences of living there have tended to lean towards being strange.
I thought about Abigail's texts yesterday.
Maybe I'm just being silly,
but I feel like I'm not alone here. What if she wasn't just being silly? What if there was something there? The thought seemed absurd, but I couldn't deny my own uneasy feelings about being there.
It looks like the place was eventually just abandoned in 1996.
Jem fell silent, and I stared ruminatively down at the floor. Haunted? Jem hadn't told me any specifics, but after hearing about those dreadful fires that had taken the lives of 2 whole families, it didn't surprise me that the place was full of bad energy.
Neil?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry. Thanks for doing all of that, Jem. I really appreciate it. She coughed quietly.
Is Abby okay? I haven't spoken to her for a few days. I thought she might have wanted some space.
I hesitated. I don't know. I think I'm going to head back to the house tomorrow. Tell my boss it's an emergency. I'm worried about leaving her there alone.
What about the house itself?
I bit my lip. I'm not sure yet. I need to hear what Abby says. I'm going to call her straight away. Jem hummed.
Okay, let me know that she's okay. You know how I worry.
She said with a faint chuckle. Thanks, Jem. Bye. I hung up, dragging a deep breath into my lungs. Now that I had a better sense of the house's history, I was worried about Abby. I feel like I'd made a horrible mistake by leaving her there alone. I pulled up her number and hit dial, my legs bouncing anxiously. Please answer. Please answer. The dial tone rang for quite a few seconds before the line was finally picked up.
Neil?
Abby? I said, flooded with relief. Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine,
she said, but there was an unconvincing edge to her voice. Has something happened? She stayed silent, and I could hear her breathing on the other end. It sounded slightly ragged.
No.
Abby, I said gently, please talk to me.
I don't know, Neil. I don't know what it was,
she said, her voice trembling slightly.
I feel like there's something wrong with my head.
There isn't, I said firmly. There's nothing wrong with you. Look, I'm coming back tomorrow. Please hang on until then. She sniffed quietly. Okay. Call me if anything else happens.
I will.
She went quiet, but neither of us hung up. I couldn't quite bring myself to tell her everything Jem had told me over the phone. It didn't seem fair.
I'm sorry, Neil. I'm just confused,
she said after a moment.
I thought I saw something, but I don't know if it was real or not.
I don't know if things are just getting a bit much for me. You're strong, Abby, I said. But you're only human. You've been dealing with a lot these past few months. Try not to be so hard on yourself. She hummed quietly. Do you feel in danger there? I can come and get you now if you don't want to stay. No, it's fine. I don't feel in any danger, she said quickly. And I couldn't discern from her voice if she was being honest or not. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, see you tomorrow. Chapter 9. Abigail. That night, I was dreaming again. I dreamt of a girl with no face, with blackened holes for eyes, and lips stretched into a wet, grinning smile. I dreamt of a house on fire, flames curling and twisting into the night like snakes. I dreamt of my grandma, the woman I barely knew, who had once called this place her home. I dreamt of things in the darkness, things with clammy fingers and gurgling voices, things that asked me to help them, even though I couldn't. When I woke up, it was still dark. The dreams lingered, but I tried to forget them, tried to forget the horrible, scarred face of the child I'd seen in the study. I tried to tell myself it hadn't been real. None of it was real. It was just my head, seeing things that weren't there. The room was cold, and goosebumps ran along my skin. When I sighed, I could almost make out the tendrils of my breath chilled in the air. The soft patter of paws drew my attention. The cat was pacing in front of the doorway, whining softly. What's the matter? You want to go out? Breathing heavily through my nose, I pushed myself off the couch and went to the door. I paused with my hand resting against it, a shudder going through me. There was someone crying on the other side. I pressed my ear against the wood, holding my breath. A child's cry. My knees started to shake as fear swept over my body. The dreams came back to me, as clear as memories ingrained in my head. The child with no face. Was she out there still? What did she want with me? I'd tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but what else was it? I couldn't be hallucinating. Is someone out there? I asked, my voice coming out hoarse. Is someone there? I received no response, but at some point, the crying had stopped. On the other side of the door, a woman laughed. It was an unpleasant, bone-chilling laugh that didn't sound like it could have come from a human, and a shiver raked itself over my body. I pushed away from the door, almost tripping over the cats hovering at my feet, and reached for my phone, pulling up Neil's contact. I wanted to leave. I wanted to go home. My eyes caught the time in the corner, and I paused before hitting dial. It was almost 2 a.m. Neil would be asleep by now, and I didn't want to disturb him. He was coming for me in the morning. I could wait until then, couldn't I? I could show the house that it wouldn't scare me away so easily. I let go of my phone, letting it slide to the floor. Outside the room, the child started crying again. The night passed slowly around me. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was the child with the burnt face. All I could hear was those wretched sobs. The door stayed firmly shut. In the dark, I sometimes imagined it creaking open, a hand appearing around it, pulling itself inside. I was shivering. The room still breathed that horrible chill, seeping out from the bones of the house. And no matter how many blankets I wrapped around me, I couldn't seem to ward it off. The rain had stopped a few hours ago, but I could still hear the irregular drip, drip, drip of water striking the floor out in the hallway. Glistening puddles, wet footprints. The wind picked up its steed, moaning softly through the house, so that I couldn't discern whether it belonged to a child or something inhuman. Shadows darted to and from across the room, thrown into relief by the occasional glare of moonlight pushing its way through the clouds. Several times I debated switching on a light or lighting a candle, but realized I preferred the dark. In the dark, I could easily convince myself that what I was seeing wasn't real. I eventually must have fallen asleep, because the next time I woke up, dawn was spreading a misty white glow through the room. The door to the hallway was open. The cat was nowhere to be seen. My body felt stiff and sore, and my eyes were heavy with fatigue. I must have gotten only a couple of hours of sleep last night, and I felt rough for it. My head was thick, and the light stung my eyes as I blinked against it. I tried not to linger on what had happened last night. It didn't matter anymore. Neil was coming back, and I'd tell him I wanted to leave. I wanted to sell the house and never think about it again. My family's past was buried here, but I was beginning to wonder if it wasn't a past that should stay buried. The house had been intimidating at first, but now it just felt unnatural. It had a bad energy that I couldn't seem to shake. It felt like the worst place to set up a bed and breakfast, and I was starting to consider abandoning the idea completely. Stepping out into the hallway, I took a moment to examine the scene. The bucket was still on the floor from where I dropped it yesterday, and there were still small pools of rainwater gathered on the steps. The footprints had dried now, if they had ever been there to begin with. Nothing else had been disturbed. There was no evidence that a child had been here, or a woman with an inhuman laugh. Whoever, or whatever they weren't here any longer. I entertained the idea of going back up to the study, but eventually decided against it. Neil would be here soon, and I wanted to leave as soon as possible. Instead, I spent the rest of the morning packing up our bags. Most of our belongings were spread across the dining room and sitting room, so it didn't take long, but it took my mind off everything else for a short while. The moment I heard a car pull up onto the gravel outside, I felt my body flood with relief. Finally, I could go home. Chapter 10. Abigail. It turned out it wasn't that simple. Neil hadn't come alone. When I went to meet him, 2 more figures climbed out from the car. My best friend Gemma was one of them. I didn't recognize the other woman. Neil pulled me straight into a hug, and I found myself shaking as I wrapped my arms around him. It had only been 2 days since he was here, but it felt longer. Those sleepless nights had taken their toll. I'm sorry for leaving you on your own, he said, holding me tighter. I'm so sorry. I shook my head, gently pulling out of his embrace. It's okay. I just want to go home now. Neil grimaced, flicking a gaze over my shoulder. Actually, I thought there was something we could do here first. Without explaining, he stepped aside, and Gemma came and wrapped her arms around me. I hadn't seen her since the funeral, and it felt good to see her again.
I'm glad you're okay, Abby,
she said.
What are you doing here, Gem?
And who's that? I asked when she pulled away, casting a curious look at the other woman, still standing by the car. Gemma exchanged a glance with Neil.
Let's go inside, and then we'll explain.
This is Melissa, Neil said once we were all assembled in the living room. Nobody sat down, so we all stood in a semicircle staring at each other. She's a paranormal psychic. I felt the blood drain from my face.
What?
Hi, nice to meet you, Melissa said amiably as she offered her hand. I touched it gingerly, embarrassed at my outburst. You too. She said, pulling away from my touch. I can feel some of the house's energies on you already. Energies? Melissa nodded, tucking a stray piece of blonde hair behind her ear. Energy that lingers after death. The more tragic or unexpected, the bigger the residue left behind. This house, as I understand it, has had quite a troubling history. I frowned in question, and Neil stepped in, clasping his hands behind him. I didn't want to tell you over the phone, but there were 2 fires that happened here. The first one killed the Crow family, and the second, my family. I finished for him, remembering the photo. The Owens. But my grandma?
There was a single survivor,
Jem added, cocking her head.
A child survived the fire. Lucy Owens. That's your grandma, isn't it?
I nodded, feeling myself stagger slightly. It was a lot to take in all at once. Neil caught my arm, holding me steady. I'm sorry you had to find out like this. This was the house that had claimed the lives of my ancestors. The house that had housed the death of my grandma's family, except for her, the only survivor. No wonder my mother had hoped to keep this place a secret from me. With the horrible events staining its history, she'd probably wanted to leave it behind, forgotten about. You said you saw something, Neil prompted, keeping his voice low. A child. I saw a child with a burnt face. Melissa's face shadowed, but her eyes glinted with intrigue. You saw an apparition. I nodded hesitantly. Then the energies here are strong. At that moment, the cat skittered into the room. It looked inquisitively at the strangers, before coming and rubbing itself around my legs. I'd grown somewhat attached to the thing during the past 2 days, despite its shabby appearance. It had stopped me from feeling completely alone, at least. I reached down and patted its head. Gemma raised her eyebrows at me, but I pretended not to see it. I'm sorry. I still don't understand, I said, my glance going from Neil to the psychic. Melissa smiled, and she suddenly looked younger than I had originally thought. maybe in her 30s. Neil invited me here to cleanse the house of its negative energies, she explained, and I glanced across at my boyfriend, eyebrows arched. He looked almost sheepish, not quite able to meet my eye. He told me about the house's history and how he was worried about you staying here. He wanted to know if there was anything I could do. I wasn't expecting you to want to leave so soon, Neil added. I thought if we could get rid of all this bad stuff, you could still, turn the house into something new. I considered his words. After last night, I'd wanted to leave this place and not come back. Even more so after learning about my family's deaths here. But maybe he was right. What if I turned it into something else? Scraped away all of those bad memories and gave it new ones? It's up to you, Neil said softly. This is your house now. You decide what to do with it. I turned back to Melissa, licking my lips nervously. You said you're a psychic? She nodded. Does that mean you can speak with spirits? She smiled faintly. Yes, in a sense. I can tap into the energies of the house and see if they have anything to say. Sometimes, I'm able to ask them questions, too. Do you think you could do that? See if anyone wants to speak? There was a girl here. A girl who died in one of the fires. I would like to know her name. Melissa nodded, closing her eyes. She said nothing, but I saw that she kept twisting her fingers around a bracelet on her wrist. A repetitive motion that made me feel almost dazed the longer I watched it. After a moment of silence, she spoke in a voice that sounded strangely old and wise. Is there someone here who would like to speak with me? The silence hung like a veil between us. I felt strangely distanced from her. She began to sway gently on her feet. Child, she said, softly without opening her eyes. Can you tell me your name? A crease appeared between her brows. She seemed to be listening to something. Elizabeth? Crow? I sucked in a sharp breath. Elizabeth Crow. The girl with no face. She must have been the daughter of the original Crow who had died in the first fire. Melissa's frown deepened, her cheeks paling, and I noticed her fingers had stopped twisting her bracelet now. Her hands rested on top of each other, unmoving. All of a sudden, she threw back her head and began to laugh. My blood ran cold. It was the same laugh that I'd heard last night. Those horrible, guttural shrieks that sounded less than human. Her whole body trembled as the laughter poured from her throat, creating an uncanny visage before us. Stop it! I cried suddenly. Stop it! Leave her alone! Whoever the laughter belonged to, it wasn't Melissa. Melissa! Melissa, can you hear me? I clenched my hands into fists, hoping to reach her. I didn't really know what we were dealing with, but I had a feeling this wasn't supposed to happen. Melissa! Mama, please stop. I froze. The voice came from behind me. A child's voice, little more than a whisper, brushing across the back of my neck. When I turned around, she was there, Elizabeth Crow. the child with the burnt face. Only now the burns had gone, and I could see her clearly for the first time. Her pale cheeks, the green of her eyes. "Mama, please don't hurt anyone else." Melissa's head tipped forward, and I saw that her eyes were not her own. They were darker, brimming with a strange sort of ferocity. "Mama." Elizabeth whimpered again, stepping forward in her nightgown, her brown-haired plait swishing along her back. She looked so real, yet there was something about her that seemed somehow intangible, that if I reached out to touch her, I would feel nothing but air. "Please, leave her alone. It's time to go now." Gradually, Melissa's eyes cleared, and color began to return to her cheeks. Then the child was gone. It was as though she had never been there to start with. When I glanced at Neil and Gemma, they were looking only at Melissa, and I wondered if either of them had even seen her. "Melissa?" I said gently, as the woman blinked at us, seeming disoriented. She swayed slightly on her feet, but caught herself. "Yes, it's me," she said, reaching up to cradle her head. "I think something entered me, something that shouldn't have." "Elizabeth's mother," I supplied. "She was the one who started the fire." Neil turned to me. "What are you talking about?" "Howard Crow's wife. She was the one who burned them all," I said. A tear slid unprompted down my cheek, and I quickly wiped it away. Melissa lowered her eyes. Her skin still had an ashen tinge, and her hands were shaking. But she still stood firm. "The daughter, Elizabeth, was trying to warn me. I didn't feel her until it was too late," she said. "I'm glad you came back," I said gently, reaching forward and touching her arm gently. "Thank you. You've helped a lot." She lifted her head. "There's more I can do yet." I nodded. "If it's okay with you, I think I'd like you to stay and cleanse the house. I don't want to let the past haunt this place any longer." She nodded, smiling weakly. "I'm glad. Though I might need your help. You have a better understanding of the energies here." I nodded, though I still didn't really understand it. I just wanted to help Elizabeth and the others move on. I didn't want them to be trapped here any longer. I began, thinking about the photographs on the desk in the study. It's what my grandma would have wanted. I don't want to bury her history. I don't want the house to be forgotten about for another 20 years. I want to do something with its legacy. Neil reached out to squeeze my hand, and Gemma smiled at me from across the room. The cat mewed softly, nudging its head against my leg, and I let out a shaky laugh. "I think I'm going to stay," I decided. "I'm going to give this place a new lease on life. Turn it into a place where others can stay and appreciate its beauty. And I'm going to make Crow House my home."